Coming up in today's episode of the Conservationists Assemble. This episode is of course part 2 of my conversation with Matt Ward, and we'll be talking about the mission of the Talarak Foundation and Matt's conservation origin story. In part 1 we talked all about what makes the Visayan Warty Pig so amazing and discussed the threats to them. If you haven't checked out part 1 yet, be sure to do so. Welcome to the Conservationists Assemble, the podcast that seeks to unite with Earth's mightiest conservation heroes to raise the profile of our planet's most threatened species by putting the spotlight on the fantastic work of both in situ and ex situ conservation organisations, highlighting the link between them, as well as asking those important questions of what more can and needs to be done. I am your host, Captain Conservation, aka Johnny Bloxham, and I am inviting you to join the ranks of the Conservationists Assemble community as we take the fight to Earth's biggest villain and my arch nemesis, extinction. This episode is a continuation of part 1 on the Visayan Warty Pig and takes a look further into the work of the Talarak Foundation and the conservation origin story of its director, Matt Ward. Will you join the fight? Matt, thank you for joining me back on the podcast. We bookmarked our conversation last time after you perfectly introduced us to the world of the Visayan Warty Pig and the plight they are facing. Let's pick right up where we left off by discussing the work of the Talarak Foundation.
Yes, so the Talarak Foundation, as I mentioned, is an NGO, so it's a non-government, non-profit organization. And we're pretty much restricted until recently with this other pig species to the island of Negros. So Negros is one of the larger islands in the Philippines, sort of central to the whole country, and it's part of what we call the West Visayan faunal region. So there is a high level of endemicity within 5 islands in this central column of the Philippines. And so the goals of the Talarak Foundation were always to preserve the species endemic to that region. It was initially set up in 2009, 2010 by a local man called Fernando Gutierrez, or Dino to his friends. His nickname is Dino. And he set this foundation up, not because he's a biologist or a conservationist, but because he was passionate about wildlife. He actually works in the agricultural sector and some other things, but he had money. He had friends who had some influence, he had land, and he thought, I want to do what I can to protect and restore the endemic wildlife of this region. With some colleagues from European zoos, he set this foundation up, and they started actually with captive breeding. So the initial program was to have a captive center that would take animals from confiscations or animals from so government organizations like forestry department that had injured or rehabilitated animals and couldn't go back into the wild, take those individuals as a preservation organization or so that they could preserve the live animal, but also that genetic stock, and hopefully breed them to maintain this population in case of worst case scenario. You know, if, for example, this virus, if the virus did wipe out all the pigs in the wild, you would have a new founding population. You could have to restart your wild population at some point. That was 2010. And the Talarak actually is the local name of our emblematic hornbill. So I think we'll talk a bit more about this also in another episode. But we have 5 focal species known as the West Visayan Big 5. And the Talarak is our rufous-headed hornbill. So that's one of our big 5. And these 5 species were identified for a couple of reasons. One, because they're flagship species. You've probably talked about flagships before. These are emblematic species, animals that catch the attention, that they are glamorous, they're pretty, they're charismatic, they have something about them that people go, ooh, I like that, I want to preserve them. Not to say that they don't need protection in themselves, but if you have the option of a big, beautiful, shiny hornbill or a small brown, like, sparrow, it might be a super endemic, super rare sparrow, but people will give money to the hornbill. You know, people will care about the hornbill. So we identified these species that were more charismatic to act as flagships. But the other thing is that by having 5 species instead of just one, we protect a holistic environmental protection plan instead of just species. If, for example, we take the warty pig, we already talked about how the warty pig is an ecosystem engineer. They have the ability to influence their environment around them. So they're super, super important for the environment. But if you were to say, right, I want to protect the warty pigs, what do they need? Well, they need uh, figs, one of their favorite fruits, figs, and they need lots of dirt and leaf litter. Okay, great. You can protect 1,000 hectares, 1,000 acres of fig trees and mahogany trees. But that's not actually a healthy forest because you've only got 2 species of tree, and the pigs might be able to survive there. They love the figs, they love all the leaf litter and the bugs that live within it. But your birds, your native birds, won't like this because mahogany trees are not very good. Your native plants can't restore that forest because the mahogany trees are actually really bad plants. They're an invasive species. Um, and so you have to think about the other species. When we pick those 5, we now have animals that occupy different niches within the environment. So by picking 5 animals you want to protect, you actually protect everything. You are providing food, shelter, resources, environmental protection for all species within that region by using those 5 flagships. So this was why we created our Big Five program. We borrowed the name from Africa. They're the more famous Big Five. But our Big Five is still special. And so, yes.
Yeah, and I think you see kind of the big five being adopted in various different regions around the world. There's an Alaskan
Yeah.
equivalent, and I think it gives something for people to kind of latch onto.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's certainly a kind of a wise method to use. So in terms of some of the projects past and present, what are kind of some of the biggest achievements or biggest or previous methods that have been used to try and aid Visayan Warty Pig conservation?
Yes. So as we talked about a little bit earlier, the initial plan for Talarak was this captive breeding program. So we were able to maintain, and we still have, the largest group of Visayan Warty pigs in the world. We have, can't remember how many heads we have in total at the minute, something like 40 plus individuals, but they are from 15 different genetic lineages. And so it's about maintaining this healthy genetic stock from multiple locations around our island, so that in case of worst case scenarios, you can release them back into the wild. And maintaining this population has not been easy. You need a lot of space. You need to be on top of the genetics, on top of the breeding program. You need to identify the health of each individual and the social health as well. Animals in captivity need a lot of care on their social welfare. And we've been able to maintain these populations really well over this very long period. We did have this tragedy a couple of years ago, as I mentioned, with the outbreak of African swine fever that hit one of our centers. We thought our biosecurity was good enough. Clearly, it wasn't. But that then reinforced that we need to take this as a top priority issue. And so our existing stock of warty pigs in our zoo, technically it's a zoo, we have still a good, healthy breeding stock in that park, and they are under lock and key with top quality biosecurity as well. So we've really elevated our knowledge and our ability to implement proper animal biosecurity in some of these cases. The other thing that we've been able to do, and this started in 2021, was we opened a nature reserve. So in the south of Negros Island, there was a big tract of land. It was 300 hectares, so not national park size, but a decent size. 300 hectares, that's zero point 0.3 square kilometers or something. I'm not sure on my conversion. But this area was and still is owned by the local city, a city called Bayawan City. And this city is very progressive, very environmentally focused. And they knew about our project. So they knew about our conservation efforts. And they said, we have this area of land, which is currently going unused. It's forested, but degraded forest. It's been used and abused over many years. We would like to donate it to you to restore the habitat and restore animals, bring the animals back to this area, bring them back to the natural forests around our city. And in 2020, we started that, and the Warty pigs were one of the first animals we brought in. Again, because of their ability to help restore the land, we thought they'd be a really good addition to our plant restoration project to really get the environment going. And we released 20 pigs, 10 males and 10 females, and that was end of 2020. Now we have an estimated 100 pigs on that site because almost immediately they started breeding. Having pigs breed is not difficult in the best of times, but it's a really good indication. A brand new environment. You're taking pigs from captive centers that are in different groups and you're merging them all into one big group and you're releasing them into a completely foreign environment to them. And if they're able to breed and raise their young successfully, this is an indication that the habitat is suitable, that the environment is providing everything they need, the water, the food, the security, the social ability. They're able to meet up and share habitat enough that they are not becoming too aggressive or they're not fighting over resources. And we've been able to have this population grow really healthy, really successfully over a few years to the point where now it's a really vibrant, healthy, beautiful population of pigs, the largest population of this species in the world. And we're really proud of how we've been able to do that. We've also been able to change some minds about the pigs. People start to take more notice of it. We have had media attention here in the Philippines. We have had government attention, starting to understand the need for conservation, the impact these pigs have on the environment. But that's still an ongoing process. Whilst a lot of people now like the pigs, they have a classic look. We did a magazine article with National Geographic about the rock star pigs because of that mohawk you can see in the picture there. If you're a farmer, you still don't like the pigs. So whilst we are changing perceptions of many people, the urban people especially, those rural communities that rely on the land, still not big fans. But yes, our biggest thing is that we've still got our fantastic genetic population in captivity, and we are able to have this amazing result from these released animals, which also demonstrates it is possible to restore areas. You know, we took this relatively small patch, added a few pigs, and boom, the population is now thriving. We could do the same thing anywhere on the island. You know, we can take these animals and put them back, and without the threat of persecution and this virus, they will rebound. You know, this is a species that can be restored very quickly, very easily, if they have the ability to just be free. And so that was a really big learning curve for us.
Yeah, I'd like to actually build more on kind of that potential for population restoration, and it's great that you've kind of got that genetic stronghold in the Philippines. And you kind of mentioned that when Dino set up the organisation, initially there was some support from some kind of European zoo community or individuals. So according to Zoo Tier List website, there's currently about 46 zoos in continental Europe, as well as Asia, that house Visayan Warty pigs. If the potential for more reintroductions became available in the future, do you think some of these mainland European populations would be suitable for reintroduction as well?
There's certainly the option. It's one of those things that we're so grateful that even so, Talarak and one of our predecessors, there's another organization back in the 90s called the um, Negros Ecological. and Forestry Foundation. They're called NFEFI, Negros Forest and Ecological Foundation. That's it. Negros Forest and Ecological Foundation. They were part of the groups that sent these pigs to Europe as an assurance population. There's also a lot of pigs in America that came from the neighboring island Panay. It's the same species, but from a different island. Um, Now, this population at the time was an assurance population in case of the worst case. That might actually happen because of this virus, because of this situation we're in now. There is a possibility that the species could get wiped out in the wild on the island. And so having that genetic population in Europe could be a lifesaver to restore their species. As I mentioned, we have 15 genetic lines within the Talarak breeding program, but you don't want that to be the only genetics available for restoring a species. So those external groups in Europe, and a lot of those also support us directly still. It's a fantastic ability that we have to connect with these zoos because they have their species, because it's a species they hold in their setup. They're able to raise money from visitors. They're able to raise education and awareness as well, and then pass that on to us. And so we are getting a lot of amazing support from our colleagues in Germany, Zoo Berlin being one. Our colleagues in the UK, Chester Zoo, were a big part of our development for many, many years. Visayan Warty Pig's a big part of their stock. And this support goes towards the conservation efforts that we can then put out for the wild pigs. So even if on the short term, they're not going to come back for restoration because we do have a good stock available at the present, in the long term, they are providing support for the on-ground conservation efforts, and they are there to help restore if we need. ASF, the virus is a challenge for sending pigs. That's that big thing. But if the virus was to go away, or if we were to get a handle on it, or maybe a vaccine was available for the virus, it is certainly possible that we could take pigs from Europe and have them help boost our genetic diversity with the restoration program. That is true.
And aside from that, that funding and research is obviously very crucial. And actually, Chester was where I first ever saw a Visayan Warty Pig, and yeah, I kind of fell in love with them. Um, is there anything else that you'd like to see zoos doing for this species?
Um, I think the big one, like you said, is the awareness. I mean, you said yourself, you saw them and you fell in love with them. If you were to have a little bit more education around the enclosure, it could be interactive education, it could be a billboard or something, just about how crazy intelligent the species is, about the situation they're in, how dangerous the African swine fever virus is. That kind of stuff could be really useful because there's a lot of influence from Europe in the Philippines, and vice versa. But the world is nowhere near as big as it used to be. It's a very small world now. And I think it's really important to understand how, as someone from the UK or someone from France or Germany, you could have a real big impact in the Philippines with your purchasing choices. With if you were to donate money to an NGO directly, or you donate money to a group in Europe that sends, supplies and supports, donate money to your zoos. For example, if you do adoption programs in some of these zoos in Europe, that money goes partly towards maintaining their animals, but also towards the conservation of their wild counterparts. So raising awareness of the need for conservation of these species is really important. Um, but yes, and also just raising awareness of how cool they are. Like you said, they're so interesting and they're beautiful. They're probably the best looking pig. Um, or maybe the red river hog. I think the red river hogs and the Visayan Warty pigs, they're both, they're up there. You can't beat a racing stripe. But it's one of those things that just making people more aware of how crazy, they are with their intelligence and their sociality and their language and all this stuff makes people realize not just for that species, but not to look past an animal because of its looks. Don't think, oh, it's a pig, it's just going to be rooting around in the dirt. And I think that's something we need to realize about a lot of animals. I've worked with lots of species in my career, And there are so many times where I've gone, I had no idea this species is like this until you're up close and you're working with it and you're understanding it more. Um, and I think we need to share that with people because I went to a lot of zoos growing up as a kid in the UK, and I still go to zoos. And I don't think we make a big enough fuss about how cool a lot of these animals are. You know, you've got your charismatic stuff, your tigers and your elephants and your polar bears, and that's great, you know. But get kids involved in the weird stuff, get them involved in the underrepresented stuff. Make a song and dance about how cool the Visayan Warty Pig is, because it is really, really cool.
Yeah, I think, and it's something that's really interesting. So the previous episode that just went out was about the large antlered muntjac in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and Andrew, who was representing them, made a great point about the mentality of people, and I suppose this could apply to pigs as well. That when you think of deer species, and this is perhaps relatable to the Visayan spotted deer as well, certainly from the UK standpoint, when you think about deer, you think about red deer, or you think about the muntjacs that we see at the side of the road, and you just assume that perhaps any deer species, or in this case for pig, you think that any pig species is going to be doing okay, it's going to be doing safe. So how, and again, you've mentioned the kind of the government are starting to come around to the importance and be proud of having, say, Warty pigs, but how do we start to change that mentality?
It it is hard. There's definitely generational gaps with some of that as well. Because I think, and like you said, it's the same sort of thing in the UK where potentially your grandparents' generation, they, you know, they used to eat deer meat. Maybe if you live in certain parts of the UK, red deer is still very common. But if you live in, you know, uh, Exeter or you live in London, you're going to have very different expectations on what wildlife looks like. Um, and your ancestry, and if you got deer heads in your house, then it's like, oh yeah, no, deer are very common. You know, my granddad used to shoot them all the time. But it's like, when was the last time you saw them? Oh, I've never seen them. So where do you know they live? Oh, I have no idea where they are. You know, and it's that kind of mentality is one thing. And so targeting those younger generations is important with the education because you want them to realize that yes, there is what their parents and what their grandparents tell them, but that was their generation, that was their truth. It's not necessarily the same truth now. And this is what we currently know. And this is a case, exactly like you said, with the pigs. And actually, this is something that we have had to fight government, especially local government, over for a long time, is how abundant these pigs are. Because they say, oh, but we've always got, you know, people complaining about the pigs eating their crops. And, you know, pigs have been, I've seen pigs in this forest as long as I remember. And you say, when was the last time you actually saw them? Oh, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. It's like, and when was the last time you were at the forest? Oh, maybe, you know, a year ago. So it's like, so you haven't seen it in the last few times you've been there, but you don't register that as being a case of them going. You just didn't care. And when you start talking to people about this and you start talking to people and getting to understand that just because something used to be abundant doesn't mean it still is. And then you start showing them why they're losing these pigs. You start showing them the data of how they're being lost on massive numbers. Then they start to appreciate that. But again, you're fighting a battle against someone and their personal experiences if you go for those older generations. If you go for the younger generations, they have no experience. So your information is brand new information to them. And I think that's where a lot of our education is coming into now. Of course, we don't want to pit kids against their parents or anything like that. We want the parents to also learn about this. We want the grandparents to learn about this. And we want to be able to challenge these older generations and say, we're not saying what you're saying isn't true, but what we're saying is think hard about now versus then and how much has changed. Because every single time we do that, they go, oh, yeah. Like, no, 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 they're everywhere. They're everywhere. When was the last time? When was the last time you saw a group of pigs? When was the last time you had an issue with the pigs? Um, Oh yeah, no, it was a while ago. And it's just one of these things. So I'd say when it comes to sort of education, we do target the young because we want them to grow up realizing the pigs are in danger and they want to help save them. But we have a different sort of message and a different patience for the older generations.
Yeah, certainly. So with that, Matt, I think you've kind of detailed really nicely what Talarak is all about, where they're heading moving forward, and certainly sounds like there's a lot of crucial and exciting work to be done moving forward surrounding the Visayan Warty Pig. So we're just gonna switch track now and uncover your origin story and discuss how you got to where you are today. So yeah, Matt, could you just please give us an insight into your professional background and your journey to your current position?
Um, yes, origin story. Oh, I am Iron Man. No, I am a wildlife enthusiast and always have. Born and raised in Cornwall, southwest England, and I was raised around wildlife. Living in that part of the world, we have these beautiful sea and ocean views. We got cliffs full of birds. We got fields full of badgers and foxes and deer and other things. So I grew up when I was younger around wildlife. I then moved to Cardiff in Wales, which is very different. Um, but there is still some wildlife. There are national parks. There's other stuff that you can see. But I think, as maybe for yourself as well, being British, and for a lot of people in the Western world, TV was kind of one of the big things that inspired me. Watching nature documentaries, getting Animal Planet on cable, so you could learn about animals from all over the world. Watching BBC documentaries with Sir David Attenborough, who I've been blessed to meet a few times. I actually graduated with Sir David Attenborough. That's one of my claims to fame. Um, when I graduated in zoology in Nottingham Trent University, David Attenborough got an honorary doctorate at the same time. So,
That's so cool.
um, yes, so I graduated with Sir David Attenborough. Um, but it was documentaries. It was also zoos. I'm very pro zoo, which is not a common thing in wildlife conservation these days. Usually, field conservationists tend to be wanting to see animals outside. They don't want them in cages. But I appreciate the need for zoos in terms of both the captive breeding and maintenance of genetic individuals, but also awareness. I learned so much about going to zoos and London Zoo and Bristol Zoo and Chester Zoo and all these guys in the UK. And I learned so much about different species I'd never heard of before because they were on display and there was education information, or there was education rangers, and there were people that could talk to you about these species. Um, so I learned about nature, and sadly, I learned about exotic animals a lot. So when I was growing up, I was like, right, I'm going to go into wildlife science, and I'm going to go out into the world, and I'm going to study all the animals. Kind of like Pokemon, I wanted to get out and study them all. Um, but when I graduated from Nottingham Trent University, immediately went out and I went to Israel and I worked with Arabian oryx in Israel. And then I went to South Africa and I worked in South Africa on several species. I spent a long time in South Africa, a couple of years collectively. I worked with elephants. I worked on a conservation project that was looking at the impact elephants were having on natural habitat. So I did a lot of work with bird communities because they were bioindicators for habitat health. I worked with striped mice, which are another really cool and underrated species, the African four-striped mouse. Um, I went to Madagascar for a while. I set up a conservation breeding center in Madagascar for endemic frogs. And I worked with some amazing people there. I went to Indonesia, where I worked with a friend of mine on slow loris, which is another crazy, really interesting species. Um, I worked in Thailand on king cobras and a critically endangered tortoise, the elongated tortoise. And that was where I honed more of my management skills and sort of project management stuff. And then in Thailand, I was there for many years, and that's when I came to the Philippines. I've never really had a regional preference. It's not like, oh, I wanted to work in Africa or
Sure.
Asia or South America or anything like that. I also never had a species preference. When I was younger, I was really into reptiles, and I did work with frogs and snakes and tortoises and other stuff. But I also was interested in birds, and I was interested in mammals, and I was, it for me, it was the species and why it was important. So it wasn't because it was a reptile or because it was a mammal or because it was a tiger or because it was an elephant. It was why am I needed to study this species or this ecosystem or this environment or this behavior. And that's always been one of my focuses too is animal behavior. So, for example, the striped mouse, I was looking at reproductive behavior. For the tortoises, I was looking at spatial ecology and habitat. King cobras, again, spatial human conflict and other things like that. So, I've always been more interested in the interactions with the animal, the environment, and the threats around it. Um, so yes, I've been very, very fortunate, very blessed to be able to get to work with some amazing wildlife, some amazing people, amazing institutions all over the world. And now I'm here. And I came here in 2019 to the Talarak Foundation to help set up the nature reserve. So that was already in their mind when they hired me, was to come in and help set up this nature reserve, to do the wildlife monitoring, to do the releases, that kind of stuff, which I had experience with. And after a couple of years of doing that activity, the reserve was going really well. The management of Talarak Dino said, "Well, why don't you take over everything? You've got good conservation skills, experience. I got a lot of networking within the zoos in Europe and the UK." And they said, "Well, come on as a director and help direct this foundation to a place where we are having a bigger impact in conservation as a whole." And that's what I'm doing today. So now we have a huge network of partners. We do education both at the local level and at the sort of academic level. So we have a network of one, two, three, four, five, six to eight local universities that we work with for student development, biodiversity, conservation research within local schools. We also have several universities internationally that we work with for, again, developing student thesis projects, internship projects, and developing knowledge on species that those universities are interested in. We have dozens of zoos that we work with for similar things. We have our own zoo that we operate, which has public education. We have a lot of amazing programs at that zoo for school education, family and homeschool education as well. Anyone who is anyone can get access to education within our programs. One of the fundamental drivers that I have for conservation is that we do applied conservation in the field and in the zoo, but we educate about conservation to anyone who will listen to us. It should not be for paid programs. It should not be for like exclusive groups. It should be for everyone because everyone has a part to play. Everyone has the ability to do something amazing for conservation, whether you're a biologist or a conservationist or a lawyer or a doctor or you work in a shop. You just work 9 to 5 in a store, minimum wage. You can still have an impact in conservation. And if you're interested in doing those things, there are little things you can do that get you more involved. So yes, that is my my origin story to where we are now.
That is certainly fantastic. It sounds like, yeah, you've kind of tried a bit of everything, and that is molded where you are. And I just want to go back to a point where you mentioned briefly about how some field organizations obviously want to see animals in the wild and not necessarily in kind of an ex situ population. And for lack of a better word, how do we mitigate that kind of them and us mindset to the point where there's now the one plan approach that's being thrown out
Yeah.
there, that it's zoos and in situ organizations together that are really going to make that difference.
I think that's the way forward. I think it's all about showing rather than saying how it works. Our foundation's a great example of that, both within our own captive program, but also the zoos that support us. You know, without the support, the academic support, the advice, the knowledge, and very importantly, the funding, we couldn't do this. As an NGO, we don't make money. You know, we're not a business, so we can't afford a big staff. We can't afford programs that are expensive to run because you are looking to help build community development and sustainability within rural communities. That costs money. Monitoring animals, camera traps, radio telemetry, fencing for your nature reserves. All of these things cost money. And that money comes from these zoos. Um, and there needs to be more evidence, visible evidence of the need for this in situ, ex situ partnership programs, which the One Plan approach talks about. Um, there's definitely opportunity for repatriation programs. So a lot of zoos do have this program. A lot of zoos in Europe, it seems ridiculous and implausible for most people that visit the zoo in Europe, but there may be rhinos or crocodiles or gorillas or hamsters which go from the zoo and get repatriated back into the wild. It's very expensive, doesn't happen all the time, but we can make it happen. Um, and I think that's where we need to just keep working on showing the world that it works. The one plan approach works. Having this beautiful relationship between in situ, ex situ for the same conservation purposes, it can work. I have a lot of respect for conservationists as a whole. And so I would never say that, oh, if you're a conservationist and you are working on conservation in situ and you don't like zoos, I'm not going to turn my nose up at you. I'm not going to ignore what you're saying because you're still having an important role in conservation. I have had lots of pleasant experiences with zoos. I used to work in a zoo many, many years ago too. I used to work in Bristol Zoo in the UK. Um, but I also know that not all zoos are good. And so I think the good zoo movement is an important part of this as well. We have standards, we have these organizations like the European Association for Zoos and Aquaria, the British and Irish Association for Zoos and Aquaria. They're all over the world. We have these associations. Even here in the Philippines, we have the Philippine Zoo Association, which we are a part of. These associations generally have standards for welfare, for conservation activities. And so those standards, they're getting higher and higher every year. More and more need for zoos to do a good job with maintaining their wildlife, but having an impact in conservation. And that's that big one. Don't just have things because they're shiny and nice, have things because they make a difference to conservation. Um, and I think supporting those good zoos is important because the minute, and I saw this when I was in the UK decade or two ago, there was that movement in the sort of early 2000s, mid 2000s, where there was the anti-zoo movement. Zoos are just keeping animals. A lot of the origin of those animals was dubious. Animals have been taken from the wild for zoo collections. And so there's a big anti-zoo movement. But the minute you stop going to zoos, full stop, like boycott all zoos, those good zoos that have the potential to save species, that have the ability to help in situ conservation projects, they can't do that anymore. So it's about being smart with your zoo selection. Not all zoos are good. Do a little bit of research, have a look at their mission, have a look at what they're doing, and then support them, visit them, enjoy yourself, learn about what you're doing, enjoy seeing those animals being cared for as best as possible, being given the life that they wouldn't have in the wild, and realize that supporting that is supporting the ones in the wild. Because realistically, 99.999% of the people that visit zoos in Europe and the UK will never see those animals in the wild because these are species which are so rare or so endangered or so far flung that you're never going to get them. And so you get to see this species, you get to learn about it, and you get to know that by supporting it, by donating, by adopting an animal in a zoo, just by paying your entry fee, you are supporting the conservation work that goes on in the world. And I think that's what we need to keep showing, highlighting that it does make a difference.
Absolutely, and I suppose it's important to mention that the secondary benefit of researching the good zoos that you should be investing your time and, if willing, money into is gonna either make it do or die for those that don't quite meet standards. If they aren't interested in upping their standards, they're gonna fail or they're gonna stop operating, which
Yeah,
is good for conservation, or they're gonna up their standards, which again, great for
yeah,
conservation
yeah. It's
in
still
order to
good
meet
for
those.
conservation. Yeah, yeah. No,
So
very true.
you've mentioned that you're pro zoo, and that's great, and that you've kind of mentioned well, that you've worked at Bristol Zoo. Having come from Cornwall, we know that there's some great zoos down there. What was your first experience with a zoo?
Oh, my first zoo experience. It might have been Newquay Zoo, Newquay or Paynton. Back in the day, I went to Paynton Zoo quite a lot. Um, I had family out in where is it? Out in Suffolk. There's a really nice park out in Suffolk. I can't remember what it's called now. Not Colchester, but there's a zoo out in Suffolk somewhere, which is quite nice. I've done most of the UK zoos because as I was growing up, whenever we went somewhere, we would go to the zoo and check it out. And again, we went to some zoos and you see that they're not doing zoo. I'm not going to name names, but there are some zoos out there which they're not great. But then there are other zoos and you see either they're not great, but you see the effort they're making to get better, or you see that they have already done that. And I think actually Bristol Zoo is a good example of this because back in the day, like decades and decades ago. Bristol Zoo is a very old zoo. It's the fifth oldest zoo in the world. And it was the first one built outside of a capital city. A little bit of Bristol Zoo factory. But Bristol Zoo, back in the sort of 50s to 90s, had elephants and bears and all the classic big flagship species. But they weren't at the right capacity to do that. It's a very small inner city zoo. And it was concrete structures. And the animals were not the best health. They are probably very stressed. And Bristol realized this. So, as those animals died, or if those animals were moved on to other zoos, they changed their structure. They changed the way they were going to deal with things so they wouldn't keep these big, large animals that needed massive open spaces. And if they did have something, like they got a pair of Asiatic lions, which is an important animal for breeding purposes, captive breeding. It's an endangered species, might even be critically endangered. In the wild, there's a lot of issues with them. And in captivity, there's not that many of them. So captive breeding of this species is important. And they realize that's an important thing that they need to do. So they have an enclosure. It's not a big, huge, beautiful safari park style enclosure. So what do? We have to make sure the enclosure has enrichment. We have to make sure that the animals are enriched, that we take care and monitor their mental health and their physical health. And those are the aspects that you saw changing with the zoo as the years go by. So even though, and it's really sad now that the original Bristol Zoo in Clifton has sadly been sold and has stopped functioning, they have their new park, which is much bigger. They have bigger enclosure spaces because that's something they wanted to have for these species. They have more mixed exhibits as well, which helps those individual species in those exhibits interact with other species, which is actually quite an important part of most animals' lives. Animals don't live in just a single, them and their family situation. They live in mixed ecosystems with lots of other things. Um, and so definitely Bristol have shown that you can move from an old-fashioned style setup to a modern improved welfare using all the knowledge that we have to become better. And so that's why I always champion Bristol as being one of those examples that it can be done. Um, but yeah, I think that's one of those things that Bristol inspired me in some ways, knowing the team and the research they were doing, knowing the field work they were involved in. That's how I realized that zoos actually don't just donate the odd quid here and there, but zoos put thousands and thousands of pounds into field conservation. When I was working with Bristol and I saw the programs that they were supporting. So yes, my first zoo was probably something like Newquay or Paynton, but I have seen many of them.
Yeah, certainly a great nod to Bristol Zoo. They're definitely a kind of a heavy hitter in conservation and continue to do so in which is lovely to see. And so bringing it back to Visayan Warty Pigs, what was your
Yeah.
first experience with the species?
I think actually Chester Zoo. I think same as yourself. I think Chester Zoo was the first time I saw them, or at least the first time I sort of realized what they were. Um, and I've got to be honest, I think I probably overlooked them in other places. Sadly, I think I was one of those guys that, didn't think too much about some random Asian pig, which is shocking to think now, and I'm ashamed of my former self. Um, but yeah, it wasn't really, honestly, it wasn't until I got to Talarak and I actually got to see them up close and I got to hear the vocalizations and see the behavior and stuff that I realized there was much more under the skin than we gave them credit for. But I think Chester was probably my introduction to the species.
Yeah, it's great to see how you've come full circle now almost and now doing some great work advocating for them. So in terms of your current role, would you say that there's any lessons that it has taught you?
Oh, 100%. My current role, I'm a director. Well, I wear many hats. We are a small NGO, so you can't have many people in management. So I wear many hats. I'm in charge of our social media, and I'm HR, and I'm all these things as well. Um, but through this, through the foundation, through the activities I've been doing here, I've learned a lot about management. I've learned a lot about people management. Um, as a director as well, you are now heading the organization, so you're also the face of things. So I've learned a lot more about the diplomacy around dealing with government. We deal with government on a regular basis. And so it's a very different thing. You can't be that stern conservationist that you are inside because you alienate government. You have to look for compromises. You have to stand your ground about your ideals and what you actually need. But you can't say that this species is worth more than everything else you do. To you it is, but to them it's not. So it's about finding the way to just bring these species up. And again, the Visayan Warty Pig is a great example of that. People didn't care. Government don't care about the Visayan Warty Pig. It's just a random pig. People eat it. Who cares? So it's about bringing up how this impacts other things, how it impacts the health of the soil, how it impacts the diversity of the rest of the environment, the other things you might be more interested in. It's about bringing up the fact that it's only found on your island and one other island. So it's a part of your heritage, it's part of your culture. Your family know about this. Your ancestors lived in the forest alongside this. And do you really want this species to go extinct so that your kids and your grandkids don't know about it? It's about using all those little things to get people to appreciate it a little bit more, but not saying you need to do better. So that's the one thing that I have been taught in this position is I can't be as strong and vocal as I would like to be, because it doesn't get you very far, especially being a foreigner in the Philippines. Being an expat in the Philippines, it's a sort of what's it called, two-sided sword, where on the one side I get listened to because I'm a foreigner. There is an implicit level of respect, I guess, where if I go into a government meeting, I'm front and center. If I go into a group of conservation or scientists, oh, okay, what do you have to say? Because there's this expectation that I come with all of this previous knowledge and expertise and scientific stuff because I'm coming from the West. However, there is also the other side of, yes, but you're not from here, so we don't actually care long term. We want to hear you talk. We want to understand what you're saying. But the minute you say something we don't like, you're gone. Um, so there's a challenge there, which is why also I tend to I like doing podcasts. I like doing educational things because I'm very passionate and I can get that across. But when it comes to communicating with local communities, when it comes to communicating with local government, even with national governments and or regional governments, I'd never do that alone. I always bring my Filipino colleagues with me, partly because I want them to get experience and learning of these situations. And I want to build their capacity up so that I can step down one day and I have a local, homegrown, Negros originated Filipino conservationist who is now running everything. That's what I want. And they only get that if they get this experience. Now, time after time, getting more experience, building rapport with government and such. But also, I need to show that I'm not the only person here. This is not some foreign run organization. I'm literally the only foreigner. Everyone else is Filipino. Um, and it's one of those things where if it's a local community thing, I don't even go to it because I have no right in trying to tell a local person who is worried about money for their kids' school, who is worried about, next week, are they going to get a job or not? Is their crop going to have a good yield this year after they invest a lot of money in fertilizer and water and everything else? Are they going to have enough food next week? There is no way that I can come into that situation and start talking about conservation when this person has lived a life I can't even imagine. So that's why on those sides, when it comes to our local education and our community work, we have an entire team made up of people from the community who do our education and do our outreach for Talarak. It's important to have familiarity with anyone you're talking to. You need to be able to understand the people you're talking to, and they need to be able to respect that you know what they're saying. You know, not only would it not be fair for me to listen to someone talk about things I've never gone through and then try and tell them something, it wouldn't be fair to them for me to try and address an issue that they have no interest in. So that's why it needs to come from someone who knows how to make that announcement, who knows how to bring this topic up in a way which is respectful, in a way which makes sense, and at a time which is right, you know, because my education team won't even bother trying to educate people on the warty pigs if a pig has recently destroyed their crop, because you're telling someone that their crop and their money and their food and their lives are less important than that pig. So that's one of those situations where you need to have that local perspective.
Yeah, it sounds like, and you've highlighted it very nicely, that is a very delicate and fine balance, and it's a recurring thing that I'm hearing on the podcast that it kind of we quickly, or not quickly, but we ultimately do want to release kind of that Western gatekeeping on conservation, and certainly the ones that can make the biggest difference are the ones that are on site and have that history with the region.
Yeah, sadly, it's still an issue. And it's one of those things that I've experienced either. I'm not going to name names, but I've experienced it where you try and do like a multinational activity, whether it's a presentation or a book chapter or a paper or something, and the foreign university and the foreign professor will get credit, even though they did none of the work because of this. Again, like you said, that gatekeeping mentality of okay, we're bringing it to light. We're the ones who people recognize the names of. We're the ones everyone's going to be praising. So we're the ones who are going to be front and center. And you who do all the work, you're going to be at the side. And it, being a white male from the UK, it's the first time I've been in this situation. But it's crazy. And it really opened my eyes to just how often this kind of stuff does happen. That you can have scientists, even from these countries, who are overlooked, who are overtalked, who are overridden because of the Western influence. Um, and yeah, I think it's really, really important that we as much as possible, people like yourself and me and those other Westerners who have an influence in this industry, we push against that. You know, we support our colleagues in these countries and say, these guys have the capacity to do it themselves. They actually can do a good job. Don't try and mess things up. If you want to help, help. That's fantastic. But don't come in and take over. Don't come in and say that what you're doing needs to be via us. You know, it needs to be their projects because at the end of the day, it's also something where we're not going to be here forever. I don't want to be running Talarak forever. I don't want there to be this foreign influence in this local NGO. It should be a local NGO for local people, for local wildlife, full circle within the area. You know, that is how it becomes sustainable. It's not sustainable if you're reliant on people from outside keeping it alive. And the more that we isolate people from those positions, the less sustainable it is and the longer it's going to take. So we need to bring these people in. We need to build capacity. We need to give opportunity and we need to give them the floor and just step back and say, right, you guys have got this. Go ahead. I'm in the background if you need me, but you've got this.
Fantastic. And so, looking forward to the remainder of your career, be that at Talarak or wherever the road leads you, what else would you like to achieve?
Um, Honestly, I don't know. Um, my two career aims personally. I've always wanted to be a professor. I work at university. Education, as you can probably tell, I like talking about conservation and about animals and our behavior. And I have been fortunate enough that I have been able to teach several times at universities in different places. It doesn't matter where, you know, I'm not looking for Oxford to call me up. I just want to be able to educate. So I'd love to be a university professor and really develop that next batch of conservationists, you know, get more passionate individuals, the skills and the passion and determination they need to go on and do something for conservation. But I kind of like being the director of the NGO and seeing the big picture, seeing it from financing to staffing to government to all the sort of in between parts to make conservation actually happen. It's been eye opening. It's been hard, um, but when it works, it's very rewarding. And you realize the effort you put in actually has made a difference. And so I wouldn't mind doing more of this, like potentially taking on another NGO that needs capacity building, that needs bringing up, that needs revitalizing to get to that next step and doing something like that.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, Matt, what a great origin story you've had, and what you want to get out of the remainder of your career seems very promising. And so, to close out our conversation today, we're just going to have some quick fire questions to finish up on. Are you ready?
Go for it.
Great.
Yes.
Are there any dream species that you would love to work with or see in the wild?
Well, not really. Like I said, I'm not really a species person. Um, Pandas, I love pandas. I think they're actually really misunderstood. But yeah, otherwise, there's nothing that jumps off the top of my head.
Yep, fair enough. Just happy to see what you stumble across, kind of thing.
Yeah,
Are there any places then that you'd love to visit? You've mentioned kind of the variety of places that you've worked in.
yeah. again, I'm not really a like regionally or country specific person. I've never done South America, but I'm also not that interested. Weirdly, everyone loves South America, and I've heard a lot of amazing stuff about it. I'd love to visit some of the conservation stuff in South America. Um, I already did Madagascar. That was one of my dreams. Um, Weirdly, maybe Antarctica.
Yeah,
I'd love to see what the sort of the fauna, the biogeography is like in Antarctica. Look at some of that.
yeah, I can get on board with that. That sounds pretty cool. After a day fighting extinction, how do you relax?
Oh, relax. What's that? How does that work?
True.
Yeah. If I can relax, I tend to just watch movies.
Hmm.
I sort of zombie out. I'm like, right, I've had like 72 hours, 100 hours of activity. I'm gonna just zombie out, and yeah, I just stick a movie on or something. Um, what do I like recently? I'm a big nerd for like Godzilla stuff.
Yeah,
So they're not good movies, but I'll just stick on like Godzilla versus Kong, or all that stuff, Skull Island, or the first Godzilla. Anything but the 1990s one in New York. That was a terrible. Um,
yeah, they've certainly made a cool universe around it. So yeah, no, I get that. I watched -1 very recently, and I actually really enjoyed that.
yeah, I did too. I watched it, and I was pleasantly surprised how good it was storyline wise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really, really good. And so, how can listeners follow your work and the work of Talarak?
Um, My work, well, I have a research gate, which is, like social media for scientists. I have a research gate and a LinkedIn. I'm not very active on those, but my research gate has my papers. So anytime I publish a paper, I'm writing a lot of papers right now. They'll be on there. Talarak, though, I manage the website and the social media. So follow Talarak on our website, talarak.org. We have a Facebook and an Instagram page as well, Talarak Foundation, and there's cool stuff. We put videos from our camera traps a lot. So if you look at any of our stuff, we got lots of facts, education, just cool images and cool videos from the different species we work with. Also the work we do with the communities, with the people. We do shout outs sometimes to our different staff members and interns and students. So yes, follow us on social media, and we do animal adoptions. So if anyone is interested in adopting one of our species, go to our website, and we have an adoption page with multiple tiers. So there's like what are they called? Conservation Hero is 25,000 pesos, which is about, oh, that is in pounds, but it's an annual thing. It's not monthly. So we have 25,000 pesos for our most expensive one, or 1,000 pesos is our cheapest one. So a little bit of donation, sort of between like £20 and a couple £100 to adopt one of the animals that we have in our conservation centres, and that money goes towards all the conservation activities we do around those species.
Fantastic. Hopefully, there'll be a bit more uptake for that. But with that answer, Matt, you have answered my last question for you today. So thank you so much for your time teaming up with me on the podcast to discuss this awesome species and the amazing work of Talarak Foundation. I certainly look forward to seeing what the organisation continues to do for the future of the Warty Pig. And of course, this will not be the last time the podcast teams up with Talarak Foundation, as we look forward to raising the profile of the remainder of the West Visayan Big Five.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Johnny. Captain Conservation. Yes, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
No, yeah, I've really enjoyed it, and yeah, if the listeners can't tell, I'm also quite a nerd, so hence Captain Conservation there. But yeah, thank you for your time, Matt. We look forward to keeping up with the rest of the work of Talarak. And as always, a huge thank you to you, the Conservationists Assemble community, for tuning in and supporting the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and wish to join the fight to stack the odds in conservation's favour, then please share this episode with your family and friends and interact with the podcast by sharing your favourite photos and videos or stories of your favourite species. And you can also send in your favourite memories from a time at your favourite zoo or experiencing nature firsthand. And don't forget, you can have your say by expressing species, organisations or specific guests you would like to see in future episodes of the podcast. You can do all of these things by emailing Conservationists Assemble at outlook.com or by messaging on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, this is Captain Conservation signing off, over and out.